Hello everyone, I am Tisha Majumdar and I welcome you all to this panel discussion on forced migration curated under TMYS Review March 2022 in association with Global South Colloquium, University of Victoria. TMYS Review March 2022 under the current theme of migration, displacement and resettlement seeks to explore and understand the niceties of migration from the perspectives of forced migration. We are calling for submissions of stories, poems, and essays, and for project architecture and submission guidelines, please visit www.tellmeastory.biz. Today's topic of discussion is War and Resettlement, the Strenuous Journey of Disabled Refugees. We are honored to have with us Professor Ron McCallum, Professor Jill Rosenthal, Professor Pankaj Jyoti Gogoi, and Professor Mansha Mirza as our speakers today. Thank you so much for joining us. I shall now quickly introduce our speakers. Professor Ron McCallum, AO, is an emeritus professor and former Dean of Law, University of Sydney. He was the first totally blind person to be appointed to a full professorship at any Australian university. From 2008 to 2014, he served as an inaugural member of the UN Committee on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. Ron McCallum chaired this committee from 2010 to 2013. In 2011, the Australian Prime Minister designated him as Senior Australian of the Year. Our second speaker for today is Professor Jill Rosenthal. Professor Jill Rosenthal is an assistant professor of history at Hunter College, the City University of New York. Her research examines the histories of migration, identity, and humanitarian aid in the African Great Lakes region, with a focus on the legacies of colonial borders and the impacts of transnational refugee aid on both migrant and host communities. Our third speaker for today is Professor Pankaj Jyoti Gogoi. Professor Pankaj Jyoti Gogoi is an assistant professor in the Department of Political Science at Arya Vidyapeeth College, University of Guwahati. He completed his PhD in political science at Northeastern Hill University, Shillong. His books and articles have been published by internationally reputed publishers like Pearson, Routledge, and so on. His areas of interest include cultural politics and disability studies. Our fourth and final speaker for today is Professor Mansha Mirza. Professor Mansha Mirza is Associate Professor of Occupational Therapy at the University of Illinois, Chicago. She has doctoral and postdoctoral training in disability studies and health services research. Her scholarship addresses health and social service disparities among low income, underserved communities with a special focus on refugees and asylum seekers with disabilities. She has published and presented widely on this topic. So now, without further delay, I would like to call Professor Ron McCallum. I would like to request him to present his views on today's topic. Over to you, sir.
Thank you very much, Tisha, and welcome to everybody and to my fellow panelists. This is indeed a very important topic. Wars and conflicts occur and are occurring throughout our globe, and many persons with disabilities are displaced as refugees. In 2017, together with Professors Mary Kroc and Ben Saul and our doctoral colleague and myself, we published a book called Refugees with Disabilities, Forgotten and Invisible. And we conducted research in Malaysia, Indonesia, Pakistan, Uganda, Jordan, and Turkey. We used the title Forgotten and Invisible because in many instances, persons with disabilities are forgotten and invisible. I should add that our doctoral author is Laura Smith Khan, and I want to take this opportunity to acknowledge the assistance we gained, and from what I have learned from the work of Professor Manu, who's on our panel. Sorry, I'm not very good at pronouncing. Manu Miza, who is on our panel and to whom we as authors are grateful for her work. One of the myths that came to us by many people working in the field was there aren't any refugees with disabilities, they don't travel. Well, from our research, it was very clear to us that people do travel, especially in times of war. And we found that many disabilities, particularly psychosocial disabilities, were not visible. And if disabilities were not visible, they were not counted. One can argue about the Washington group questions, etc., and we argued for there to be more functional questions, as the Washington group has done. But we came to the view that if the population of persons with disabilities around the world is about 15%, the population of refugees with disabilities is likely to be higher, certainly 20% or more. Many suffer trauma and psychological injuries. In the time remaining, I want to turn to my work as an inaugural member of the UN Committee on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, which monitors the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, and I want to refer to Article 11. And it begins with the word states parties, which are technical words meaning countries. Countries shall take, in accordance with their obligations under international law, and these are the important words, including international humanitarian law and international human rights law, they must take all necessary measures to ensure the protection and safety of all persons with disabilities in situations of risk, including situations of armed conflict, humanitarian emergencies, and the occurrence of natural disasters. Now, the important words there are international humanitarian law. These are what we might call the laws of war, and they come from various Geneva Conventions. They're written in rather old-fashioned language where it talks of people as victims, and in many ways they embody the charity model of persons with disabilities, which the convention seeks to overturn. But in any event, international humanitarian law requires in war that non-combatants not be injured, that prisoners of war, particularly those with disabilities, should be looked after, and that refugees should be looked after. And all countries that have signed the Disabilities Convention have agreed to ensure as much as possible that refugees in situations of war with disabilities should be looked after. And this doesn't simply mean citizens of the host country. The convention applies to any refugees which come onto the territory of the host country. That's all I think I want to say for the moment, and I'm looking forward to what my colleagues say, and I'm looking forward to the question and answer session. Thank you, and apologies for my mispronunciation. I use synthetic speech, and sometimes the speech doesn't pronounce your names as well as I would have liked.
Thank you so much, sir. It was very enlightening to hear you. I would now like to call upon Professor Jill Rosenthal to present her views on today's topic. Over to you, ma'am.
Okay, thank you so much. And thank you so much to Tisha and to everyone else who organized this panel this morning. It's like getting cats in a row sometimes, I think, to get, and especially across all of these different time zones. So I would really, just to extend my gratitude for your organizational capabilities as well, which is something that also, of course, comes into context when we think about how to help refugees as well as to help refugees with disabilities, right? So I'm coming at this topic from the point of view of history. And in particular, my historical research has to do with refugees in the Great Lakes region of Africa. So when I think about refugees, I'm also thinking, therefore, about host communities as well. And the fact that when we think about people with disabilities within refugee groups, it's oftentimes really important to take into account the services that are available or not available to people within host communities, right? Because we know that the vast majority of refugees, I think something like 87%, of refugees are people who are living in quote unquote developing countries. However, those are being defined by the UNHCR, the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees. We also have an even larger group of people who are internally displaced persons. So in addition to those who are considered to be officially refugees by the international community, we also have an incredibly large, something like 40 million people who are internally displaced within their own countries. And I think it's incredibly important to take into account the needs of those people as well, in terms of something that our colleague just mentioned, certainly trauma, psychosocial impacts of violence and of displacement. And these are things that will certainly just increase over time, particularly when we think about the impacts of climate change. We see that those impacts are commingling with political and other disturbances within countries, within not just the global south, but the world as a whole. In terms of thinking about disabled refugees, there is a little bit of a difference in terms of how the international community has approached refugees within the so-called global south versus the northern or western world. However, again, those are being defined in very kind of archaic and sometimes terms, which is to say that while as those people who are fleeing to places such as the United States or Europe tend to be those who we find in our media conversations. Those are highlighted in the international news. However, again, the vast majority are people who actually are not attempting to enter the United States or attempting to enter Europe, but are those who have sought aid and comfort and settlement within neighboring countries. And for the most part, those people are treated as a priori refugees, which is to say that they do not need to prove the fear of persecution based on certain international conventions that we find for those who are trying to reach asylum and to apply for asylum in other countries, which is to say that for the majority of people, they are treated as a mass of people. And every person who becomes displaced, every person who becomes either internally displaced or a refugee, brings with them into asylum or into their host country their own set of tools based on their own experiences. And that will include things like vulnerabilities, but it also includes things like education. For a long time, and I think to a certain extent it continues till today, people who are fleeing conflicts in places like sub-Saharan Africa, or even as we see today, places like Myanmar, it is assumed that those people are rural, that they are farmers, right? And the problem with that is that people come again with their own backgrounds and their own abilities that need to be recognized, whether that means that they have a prior experience in community organization, something that's incredibly important when we think about people with disabilities, and something I hope to talk more about in the question and answer session. But people come with their own backgrounds and their own understandings of their lives. So rather than treating refugees as this kind of homogenous mass of people, it is incredibly important to understand their own backgrounds, their own abilities, their hopes, their understandings of their lives, their understandings of communities. And frequently, for reasons that are understandable within international humanitarian aid, when we're dealing with budgets that are shortfall, right, that are not enough, it becomes much easier to deal with populations in terms of a massive group. But whether we're dealing with refugees as a whole or whether we're dealing with refugees with disabilities, it's again to understand their own points of view, to understand how they think about the world and how they think about their own opportunities is the best way in which to help populations. And I think frequently this gets lost and becomes a sideshow to the conversation, particularly when we're dealing with large refugee camps that hold hundreds of thousands of people. So this is something that I'm hoping that we can discuss a bit more during the question and answer session. And I think that's all for now. So I look forward to continuing this conversation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, ma'am. It was very informative. I would now like to call upon the Dr. Pankaj Jyoti Gogoi to present his views on today's topic.
Okay, thank you, Trisa. At the very outset, I express my heartiest gratitude for giving me the opportunity to speak in this prestigious platform. Actually, I'm just a beginner of disability studies, and my today's presentation is basically a kind of what to say extempore kind of presentation. And I, being a person with disability, my own experience, the way I encounter disability. Uh, with these personal narratives, I will try to focus on the problems of the persons with disability, particularly living in a peripheral region of a post-colonial state, that is the Northeast India, and then I will focus some of the issues locating the whole issue of disability within the uh, socio-cultural milieu of Indian society. So I am basically a low vision person, and the problem with low vision person is that low vision is a kind of disability which is not a visibly disability. You know, when a low vision person is working with, other people, it is very difficult to identify the problems and the issue. The problems of those persons and where to intervene. So low visions are not the people are not visible as it is the case with the wheelchair person or with the a blind person. So I am a person belong to a very rural remote area of Upper Assam, that is called the Lakhimpur district of Assam, and I have migrated to Guwahati as I got the job in uh, you know in a college in Guwahati. Uh, this is the one of the urban areas of the entire northeast region. So, uh, so, and in a place like northeast, we do not have the experience of refugee camps as such, but we can draw parallel with some things like the as all of you perhaps know that northeast is basically basically projected as a conflict zone in the national or the international media, that we have a prolonged history of low intensity conflict. The various rebellion groups, they have been fighting against the Indian state, like United Alpha, United Liberation Front of Assam, NSCN, and other insurgent groups. And the situation when we are in, we are the- when we are schoolboys, we have seen those pathetic conditions, the counterinsurgency operations that took place in different parts of the region. So now the situation is relatively better, and there are many insurgent ex-insurgent leaders who have been kept in various camps, that is called the designated camp, or that is called detention camps. And there are many disabled peoples in those camps who are the victim of those low intensity conflicts. So when we are looking at disability in a conflict zone like Northeast India, we can analyze, we can look at it from two perspectives. One is the impact of conflict on disabled persons, and secondly how people are being physically or mentally disabled by the impact of conflict situation. uh, I can tell you, many stories. I had the opportunity to interact with those ex-insurgent leaders for other region in the designated camps or in detention camps. That many of them lost their hand, or they lost their eye, like that in the counterinsurgency operations, and they told us uh, some traumatic stories during the counterinsurgency operations. And particularly I can share with you one story that one uh, person in 1998, perhaps his age was at that point of time, he was of 27. Uh, he was been arrested by the armed forces, basically the Indian Army, only on the basis of suspicion, and he was killed only on the basis of suspicion in the next day. And at that point of time, his wife was a pregnant woman, and when she gave birth as child, that child was a disabled child. So when we are talking about conflict, it's not only just about the casualty and death statistics. It's revolve around the day-to-day lives and identity of the people. And secondly, now particularly what we have seen that now the new legislation that the Indian Parliament has introduced in 2016, that is the Rights of the Persons with Disability Act 2016, that has replaced the earlier act, that is the PWD Act, Persons with Disability Act 1995. So the problem is that uh, you know uh, many this new act is talking about a huge number of disabilities. Earlier, the PWD Act was talking about 7 types of disabilities. Now, this the new act, is talking about more than 21 types of disabilities. Even different types of disabilities like blood disorder, thalassemia, hemophilia. All these categories has been considered as disabled. But in the rural and the remote areas, who will identify those disabled people? In a place like Lakhimpur, or my own home district, in the district hospital, according to the act, there should be a district welfare committee, and there should be a district medical board. But in the district hospitals, we do not have proper health experts. We do not have for the for mentally ill people. We do not have proper clinical psychologists or psychiatrists, for that matter, to identify those different types of disabilities. So it is a very serious problem in the rural remote areas to identify different types of disabilities. So now the 2021 census has started, but the thing is that even in 2011 census, although PWD Act identified 7 types of disabilities, but the census only considered 5 types of disabilities. So there are lots of ambiguities are there in Indian scenario, that how the enumerators of census, how they will identify those disabled, because there are lots of in disables who are not visibly disabled. So how to identify those disables? And of course we can imagine the people, particularly the disables who are there in the designated camp or detention camp, their condition is much more pathetic. So with these few words, I have just wound up my presentation. So the rest of the things we will discuss in the question answer session. Thank you.
Thank you so much, sir. It was very enlightening to hear you. I would now like to ask Professor Mansha Mirza to present her views on today's topic. Over to you,
Thank
ma'am.
Thank you so much, Tisha. And I want to commend you for all your efforts behind organizing this panel. I also feel really privileged to be part of this esteemed group. And to Professor McCullum, no worries about the way you said my name. You were close enough. So, absolutely no worries there. So, in the time that I have today, I want to focus on two issues that I don't think are discussed enough in the literature and the scholarship on refugees and displacement and disability. So, the first point that I wanted to bring up was freedom of mobility. Now, freedom of mobility is a basic human right, and everybody should be able to not only move from one place to another within their country, but should also have the freedom to leave their country and return to their country at will. And we know that that does not always happen for all refugees and asylum seekers, but especially there's a disadvantage for people with disabilities. Now, for people with disabilities that are living in refugee camps in developing countries of the global south, like many other refugees, they are often subject to forced encampment policies, which means that if you are a refugee, you're supposed to live in this circumscribed area of the refugee camp. You're not allowed to leave the camp unless you have special permission. Now, the UNHCR or other camp authorities that are managing these camps sometimes grant special permissions, but these permissions are contingent on things like the person's education level, their potential for employment, because permission is granted for people to leave the camp and maybe get an advanced education, get employment training, or to work as interpreters at the headquarters of international NGOs and humanitarian organizations. And because of negative perceptions about disability and people with disabilities not often having that privilege of education, there is often a disadvantage against them, and they're not able to avail of those special permissions to leave the camp. Now, other able bodied individuals get around this by using surreptitious means, sometimes smuggling themselves outside of the camp borders and going out into the local towns and cities. And once again, that might not be an option for many persons with disabilities, especially those who have significant physical impairments. So, in a nutshell, the freedom to move in and outside the camp is highly curtailed for people with disabilities. And we also see this during the resettlement and asylum process. Unless you've been living under a rock, you're probably aware of the current saga involving Novak Djokovic, the world's number one tennis player. And if you have been sleeping under a rock, just to catch you up very quickly, he wants to participate in the Australian Open. Australia has a mandatory vaccination policy for anyone trying to enter the country. He refuses to get vaccinated, but he still wants to participate. So he was granted a medical exception, and he landed at Melbourne Airport. And at the time, he was told that he can't enter the country. And so he's able to fight his case. I believe this upcoming week, he's going to do that. But until that happens, he was asked to live in detention at a hotel. And his family and his fans have been making a lot of noise about how unlivable the conditions are at this hotel. And what's being missed in all of this kerfuffle is that, Australia has a mandatory detention policy. So refugees and asylum seekers getting into Australia are all accommodated in what's come to be known as these refugee hotels. And conditions at these hotels or these detention centers tend to be quite unlivable. And so, if the world's number one tennis player is finding these conditions harsh, then you can imagine how difficult it might be for people with disabilities living in these types of hotels or detention centers. But what's also important is that people with disabilities are less likely to leave after having been granted asylum or detention. And that again happens for various reasons. I mean, first, during the asylum interview, you should be able to organize and synthesize and articulate information about why and how you were displaced and why you deserve asylum. And that responsibility might be a bit much for some people with cognitive and mental health impairments, and they might not be able to articulate their case very well in front of the presiding judge without suitable accommodations in place. So that is one reason. Another issue is that, asylum and resettlement countries, especially industrialized countries in the global north, prefer to resettle or grant asylum to individuals who have, quote unquote, integration potential. And what this means is that they are looking for people who they think are fit and healthy, will not be dependent on the welfare system, again, dependent being in quotes, and who will be able to contribute to the country's labor force and economy. And once again, because of negative perceptions about disability, those characteristics are not associated with people with disabilities. So they tend to be not preferred for asylum and resettlement. Now, in order to address this issue, back in 1973, the UNHCR issued a policy called 10 or more, which later became 20 or more, which means that UNHCR would try to negotiate with asylum and resettlement countries. If you're accepting people for resettlement, also try and take in at least 10 or 20 people with disabilities. And some countries did respond. For example, New Zealand is willing to accept people with disabilities contingent on medical need and on the fact that their condition be treatable and the treatment be available in New Zealand. However, when you make resettlement and asylum contingent on medical need, it kind of brings in a medical surveillance into the process that's not needed. And it also, I feel like, harkens back to the medical model of disability that a lot of people in the disability rights community reject and see as reductive. And also, it disadvantages people whose conditions might not be treatable, so people with permanent disabilities. Then there are countries like the United States that have also responded, and they prioritize resettlement of, in quotes, vulnerable refugees, and people with disabilities are counted within that category of vulnerable, which might work out well for the individual disabled refugees seeking resettlement. However, when you look at it from a philosophical level, constantly associating this idea of vulnerability with disability once again harkens back to the medical model. And a lot of research has been done with people with disabilities in asylum and seeking resettlement who don't necessarily see themselves as vulnerable on account of their impairment alone, but more so because of the living conditions of asylum. So that was one issue. And then very quickly, I want to address another issue, and that is, despite the stacks, the odds being stacked against them, or because of that, a lot of refugees and asylum seekers with disabilities kind of use their forced congregation during the asylum and the while living in refugee camps to organize at the grassroots level, and to advocate for their rights. And I'm going to quickly give you three really interesting examples here. Back during the first waves of civil unrest in Myanmar, a clinic was established at the Thailand and Burma border, and it was established by a woman doctor who was also herself a Burmese refugee of Karen ethnicity. And her and her colleagues at the clinic noticed that there were a lot of Burmese refugees coming into Thailand who were amputees and landmine survivors. So they added a prosthetics clinic. So now this clinic became a place for congregation for a lot of physically disabled Burmese refugees. And they used that opportunity to organize and establish the Karen Handicapped Welfare Association. And under the aegis of that association, they started seeking out international donors so that they could procure prosthetics and bring them back into Myanmar for those who were also landmine survivors but not fit enough to cross the border into Thailand. And they did this actually in violation of an agreement between Thailand and Burma that prohibited any kind of exchange or cross-border activity, including humanitarian aid. So it's really interesting how these people kind of got together and tried to get around some of these very draconian cross-border agreements. So that's one example. Another example is that of the Gulu Disabled Persons Association, which is a grassroots disability rights organization that was formed by people with disabilities living in internally displaced camps in the Gulu district of Uganda, which is one of the most conflict-affected regions of the country. And they kind of banded together, formed the association, and played an instrumental role in making the post-war reconstruction and rebuilding efforts in Uganda more disability inclusive. They also have a women's wing that has been very active in HIV/AIDS related activism. So trying to kind kind of take away some of the stigma associated with both disability and having HIV/AIDS. And then final example is from a refugee camp that I visited in Malawi, where people with disabilities living in that camp from many different countries of origin, like Rwanda, like Somalia, like the DR Congo, had got together and established a local disabled persons association. And they labeled themselves Imoja, which is the Swahili word for unity, to signify the idea that we come from different parts of Africa, but yet we are here united by the fact that we all have disabilities, and we need to band together to advocate for, better living shelters, better food and nutrition, and access to educational and vocational opportunities for people with disabilities living in this camp. So I just want to kind of highlight that, there is this grassroots, activism that's happening that sometimes kind of gets lost in a lot of the talk about the barriers. Not to minimize the barriers, but I think it's also important to understand that people with disabilities have agency and are aware of their rights. So I'm going to stop there, and I hope to interact more during the Q&A session.
Thank you so much, ma'am. It was a very illuminating presentation. So without further delay, we will now move on to the question answer segment. So my first question is to Professor Ron McCallum. It is often seen that disabled refugees face additional barriers while accessing healthcare services, rehabilitation, or mental health and psychological support. What steps should be taken in order to make the physical and mental healthcare services more readily available to them? Over to you, sir.
Thank you very much. Before answering the question, I'd like to make two comments consonant on earlier discussion. I guess I should say something about the Novak Djokovic case. I think it's outrageous. There was no need to put him into an asylum seeker hotel. Anywhere in Australia can be designated a detention centre, but thankfully at least it enlivened the plight of asylum seekers. And secondly, in my view, having read the materials with my wife, he has a very strong case, and it goes to the court, the Federal Circuit Court tomorrow, and I think he may win. But we'll wait and see. Second point is when discussing refugee camps, I should simply note that Australia has a very mixed approach to refugees. We have a reasonable settlement program. However, it is almost impossible to settle a refugee or a child with disabilities because of our draconian health rules, which change from time to time. However, for asylum seekers on boats, boat people, our processes have been, in my view, outrageous, putting some on offshore islands, turning back boats, etc., not recognising refoulement. Now, to answer your question, which is a very important one, I think one of the first things to do is to recognise that refugees with disabilities often have invisible disabilities. Deafness comes to mind, but more importantly, psychosocial and mental disabilities. So the first thing is to find them and is to make sure in the administrative processes that one becomes aware of people with trauma. And then, of course, it's important to set up clinics and to give assistance, which is not easy in developing countries where there are many, many refugees, and in camps that we particularly saw in Jordan and Uganda, where there are very many refugees. I think that'll do for the moment, but thank you.
Thank you so much, sir. My second question to you is that the infrastructure and physical layout of the refugee camps are sometimes unsuitable for disabled refugees to live in. The workers may also lack knowledge about disability or are not trained in disability issues, which may pose additional hindrances for disabled refugees on a daily basis. How, in your opinion, can this issue be resolved?
This is a real problem in not only designing camps, but in designing our cities and villages for we persons with disabilities. In some of the older camps, I think in one of the African camps I'm aware of, it was thought to help people with disabilities by putting them all together. And of course, that meant that there were no able-bodied persons, if I can use that expression, to assist them. It also meant that particularly women and girls with disabilities were more vulnerable to sexual exploitation and sexual assault. When I think of the Azraq camp that my wife and colleagues visited for our research in Jordan, a country that has millions of refugees, there they were working on having ramps for wheelchairs, having rails to hold on to, and where they were not putting persons with disabilities in one spot to make them more vulnerable. We need to think about persons with disabilities, and we first have to recognize, as I mentioned in my opening, that refugee populations do contain a higher level of percentage of refugees than the world percentage. That we with disabilities do travel, that if war occurs, we do travel to save our lives and those of our families, and we must train our workforce. But to have some sympathy for refugee camps, the ones in Jordan particularly, you're dealing with hundreds of thousands of refugees, and it's an extraordinary, a difficult administrative task, but we must shine the light on the plight of persons with disabilities.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. So there should be facilities because of which the disabled people will be able to live in a better condition.
Yes, yes.
Yes, sir. My next question is to Professor Jill Rosenthal. It is sometimes seen that refugee women and girls who are disabled are more prone to sexual harassment and violence. What safety measures, according to you, can be taken in order to protect them? Over to you, ma'am.
Thank you. I think to start with, I think it's important to recognize absolutely women and girls with disabilities, we know that they are more prone to experience sexual violence. This has been shown, right? But it's also important to realize that men and boys also experience sexual violence. And in ways that are much, for reasons that are fairly obvious, it's much harder to track, right? As much as it's difficult to understand and to have people come forward who have experienced sexual violence, where women and girls, for men and boys, particularly in areas where there's a normative idea of masculinity that precludes, right, even the idea of male rape, that is frequently not part of the conversation, and I think it really needs to be. In terms of measures that can be taken, one huge issue, and this isn't necessarily just for people with disabilities, but we know that women and girls are frequently those who are in charge of things like getting water and getting firewood, right? And so some very simple and kind of cost-effective ways to help is to make it easier for people to have energy-efficient stoves. That's a very simple thing, because there's frequently women and girls who are tasked with going into outside of the refugee camp, frequently illegally, right, to get wood in order to cook, right, to get water and able to take care of the hygiene of the community. So enabling people to have energy efficient stoves is one, and it doesn't have to be things that are more costly. So, for example, there are refugee women in Ethiopia who have come up with energy efficient stoves that are based on clay and those kinds of materials. And this is one way that I think would greatly impact people's lives, right? Both in terms of keeping them away from the vulnerability of walking long miles, and as well as creating and continuing deforestation around refugee camps, which we know is a huge problem, but also in terms of keeping them safe, right, from the impact of sexual violence. In addition, I think it's really important to keep in mind that women and girls are really impacted by the types of food that are available in refugee camps. So, for example, when the United States donates unmilled maize to refugee camps in places like Uganda, that requires a great deal of wood in order to cook, right? And so thinking about, how are our supply chains impacting women, girls impacting men, and boys as well, these are important considerations. So what is the difference between providing unmilled maize, for example, versus cash-based relief, right? There's a huge difference there in terms of agency, in terms of the ability of people to decide what types of food are culturally appropriate for themselves, what types of food they actually want to have, versus what is being dictated to them by the so-called humanitarian international community. So those are some kind of basic measures that can be put in place that I think would greatly impact women and girls as well as men and boys, right? In terms of their safety and their food, their themselves.
Yes, ma'am. So protection should not only be given to girls and women, but also to men and boys who also suffer from the same problems regarding sexual violence and all. So my second question to you is that often lack of legal knowledge as well as awareness of their rights causes refugees with disabilities to miss out on various opportunities like humanitarian aid in the host country. What steps can be taken by the organizations in the host country to keep these refugees well informed about all the possibilities?
Right. I mean, this is a huge problem. And it's a problem that exists not only at the level of refugee or even internally displaced persons, but also at the level of host communities, which is to say that frequently police officers, magistrates, people within host communities at every level do not have any awareness of the laws that are in place both at the national and at international levels to protect displaced persons. And so I think so at the level of within, if we're thinking about refugee camps or IDP camps themselves, having basic information being presented in a way that is more accessible to people, which includes using illustrations. It includes having people who are perhaps interpreters of local idioms of sign language, caretakers, um, perhaps even having trainings within IDP camps as well as refugee camps to have people become aware of what their rights are, again, under both those host nations' laws as well as international law, is incredibly important. But I think even more so is the imperative to have, again, those host community members, whether they be policemen, judges, people who are involved in prisons, right? To make them aware of what the country laws are, um, that's a huge step in terms of being able to then protect not just disabled refugees or disabled IDPs, but the whole displaced community, just to make them aware of what those rights are. And I think that particularly in the case of Uganda, we've seen a huge impact in terms of working with and even training and helping to educate paralegals within the host community as well as lawyers within that host community. So again, taking the focus away from the kind of expatriate humanitarian aid international side and bringing that spotlight within and having a dialogue between host and refugee IDP communities can go a really long way in terms of protecting people's legal rights. And of course, having, again, a kind of more accessible information, including things like having signage being posted in ways that are at an angle so that people who are in wheelchairs can see them. All of these things are additionally important. Radio can be really helpful as well for people who are visually impaired, for people who are hearing impaired, having the visuals, printed material, but not necessarily, a lot of people cannot read, right? Or maybe they cannot read a certain language. So it's important to be able to have illustrations alongside of the written material.
Thank you so much, ma'am. So, my next question is to Professor Pankaj Jyoti Gogoi. Physical disability of a victim of war, insurgency, or other conflict situations could also have serious repercussions for their emotional, psychological, or economic well being. How do you see this in the Indian context? Are the various acts and policies of the government helpful in this regard? Over to you, sir.
Okay. Thank you very much. Yes, I think already pointed out, particularly in a conflict zone, disability is not only the physical disability or the kind of disability that has been defined by various legislation in India, but in a conflict zone when the uh, the earner of the family died in the counterinsurgency operation, then the whole family become economically disabled. Economic and emotional disability. That the family suffers in the conflict zone. That issues has had not been addressed by the legal discourse of disability. And as I have told you that now the new act, that is the Rights of the Persons with Disability Act 2016, it is of course a very comprehensive act that has included many things. Uh, I think in long run also law will play a significant role in the whole process of the emancipation of persons with disability. But the problem is that when we are talking about facilities, say for example, you know uh, now the good thing is that although disability is a marginalized and disenfranchised community, but visually the whole issue has become more and more politicized issue, and lots of popular policies have been adopted by the government of India. But the thing is that, say for example, earlier we had a policy called Policy for the Implementation of Persons with Disability Act. An institution, that may be an educational institution, or that may be a government office, they can apply to the Ministry of Social Justice and Empowerment for making the infrastructure disabled friendly under the PWD Act 1995. But from 2014 onwards, when BJP government came to power, they made all this. They diverted the whole fund to the Accessible India campaign. In Accessible India campaigning is a very popular political campaign for persons with disability. Now, what happened is that an institution or an organization, they cannot directly apply fund for the central government for making their institution disable friendly. Rather, the government will select certain areas. Say, for example, 2015, when this campaign was being declared, Accessible India, 25 cities has been included for making them visible friendly, and Guwahati is of course one of them. Uh, so now, what the government or the act is saying is that within 5 years you have to make your infrastructure disabled friendly. But the biggest problem is the fund. Now, in my own college, I am requesting my authority to make the environment disabled friendly, but there are lots of constraints because of lack of funds. So this is very significant problem that we are confronting. And if similar is the case, although Guwahati is one of the 25 cities of India that has been targeted by the Accessible India campaign, I, as a low vision person, when I drive a car in the city like Guwahati, this is out of compulsion. I have to drive a car because I am a new settler and as in Guwahati city, and my middle class economic background, of course, does not allow me to appoint a permanent driver. So what happened, in Guwahati city, we do not have proper digitized traffic system. Most of the time in the traffic points, they control the traffic. Traffic police, the constables, they control the traffic with hand. They raise their hand, and most of the time, in case of me, what I do, I follow the car that has been drive in front of me. But I become very confused when I am in front of the traffic police and there is no car in front of me and the policeman is signaling me with hand. So it is a very confusing situation. And at many point of time, the policemen, they check my driving license, they check my disability card, and they ask me to go for further treatment and all. There are lots of funny stories with this. So these are the things that now, similar is the case with many things. When the government organized this World International Disability Day in 3rd of December, I interviewed a few disabled beggars in Guwahati railway station. You know, they are basically migrant workers, basically coming from very remote areas of Assam and the other parts of northeast. And many people say that as you know that Assam is a place that has been marked by the xenophobia of illegal immigration. Basically, people you know, coming from East Bengal or erstwhile East Bengal. So basically, these communities, the minority communities, they are coming from very remote rural areas, and they came to Guwahati for better job opportunities, and they work in Guwahati city as a domestic helper. But they had some physical problems. They have some congenital problems in the young age. They were in a position to work, somehow they can manage their livelihood, but once they getting old, say for example, there are many people who are blind, maybe because of congenital glaucoma. They had problems in the early age, they had low vision like me, but because of lack of proper treatment, you know, uh, proper medication, at some point of time, these people, they become disabled, and they uh, go to the railway stations and temples and other such areas. And most of the time, what government do, they they took all these people from the railway station and and government organize various programs, and they distribute various things. Sometimes they provide money, or sometimes they provide wheelchair. So at the end of the meeting, they have been again sent to the railway station all the time. So this is the things that is happening in full sense of the term. It is very much kind of cosmetic arrangement that we have been witnessing in contemporary time. It is actually, of course, it is becoming, and similar is the case with the terminologies like Divyanga. That reflects the mythical narratives that are associated with the cultural milieu of Indian society. Say, for example, when a person become disabled as war victim. Say, for example, when a soldier become disabled, his disability is being glorified because he became disabled for the cause of the nation. But when a person by birth, he or she is a disabled, what we say that this person is disabled because of the misdeeds that he or she did in the past life, the karma dharma theory. So these are the different, cultural nuances, that needs serious attention. We need to understand the things, and we need to address the issues. We need to address the deeper complexities of the problem, the cosmetic policies. Say, for example, now government is talking about digital India. Now government, if a disabled person, if he or she is supposed to get the benefits of various government schemes, he or she must have a unique identity card, and that unique identity card they have to apply digitally online. But imagine the situation in a rural remote area, poor people, illiterate people, whether these people are in a position to handle mobile phone or computer for applying digital unique identity card to get the benefits of the government schemes. So these are the challenges. Of course, disability has become a more politicized issue, but all these things at many point of time, it seems to be a kind of cosmetic development.
Thank you, sir. So you were talking about disability-friendly infrastructure. So for that, my next question to you is: disabled people are often victims of marginalization and social stigma. The situation aggravates when they belong to a region with no basic disability-friendly infrastructure in public spaces. What is your take on this with reference to your place of origin, that is the northeast of India? Over to you, sir.
Yeah. I have already mentioned these issues that I think there should be a rethinking of the policies that now we are talking about, inclusive education rather than integrated or special education for persons with disability. But and the act is also talking about, say for example, although the act is very inclusive in nature, the act, RPWD Act 2016, talks about reasonable accommodation of persons with disability. So what kind of reasonable accommodation you are talking about? If you remember the PWD Act of 1995, it has made some clear provisions. Say for example, for a blind person, if he or she appeared in the examination, so if it is a 3 hours examination, then he or she will get 40 minutes extra time, and he or she will get a scribe or writer who is 2 years academically junior to him. Say for example, he is appearing in the class 10 examination, then the scribe or the writer will be of class 8. So that kind of things are very clearly mentioned in the earlier act. But now this act is talking about reasonable accommodation. What kind of reasonable accommodation? Who will define the reasonable accommodation? Whether the authority or the person with disability. So there are some gray areas in the act itself. So and secondly, the over centralization. Everything has been overtly centralized. Say for example, the Accessible India campaign and all. So at the same time, when we are talking about disabled friendly environment, say for example, uh, Rashtriya Uচ্চ Shiksha Abhijan and other missions that government is introducing, they should also, government should also emphasize they must allot certain fund for the particular institution for building, disabled friendly environment. And still we have, lots of stigmas in relating to disability. Even in my own college, I often at the time of admission, I often emphasize the authority to maintain 5% reservation for persons with disability. But the problem is that in the college, when three or four students, blind students, they took admission in the college, it's difficult for the teachers to teach them, because teachers are not trained teachers to, teach those visually impaired person. And the government, although government is talking about inclusive education, but in the higher education sector, in which I am directly associated, maybe in Guwahati University or in my own college, what happened is that at the same time we have to appoint a trained teacher for visually impaired students when we admit blind students in the college. So in that sense, it seems to be very good, but in the ground level we have lots of challenges. This time we have admitted more than four, blind students, but now they are suffering because we do not have proper trained teachers to facilitate those students. So these are the ground realities that we are confronting in day-to-day life. Thank you.
Thank you so much, sir. So basically, the government should work more on making public spaces and institutions disability friendly, so that everyone can have like a good infrastructure to depend on and like interact publicly.
Right.
So thank you, sir. So my first question to Professor Mansha Mirza is: one of the major problems faced by disabled refugees when they arrive in the host country is language barrier. It is also seen that not many opportunities are available to learn the language of the host country or to increase language skills. This may affect them on a daily basis. Could you throw some light on how this issue may be resolved? Over to
Sure,
you,
and
sir.
I want to thank you for bringing that up. So language barriers are an issue in resettlement countries when the refugees coming in don't speak the dominant local language, and they affect everyone, right? Not just refugees with disabilities, but also those without disabilities. So across the board, what we need is more bilingual interpreters, especially at public service institutions such as public hospitals, public clinics, and other social service organizations. Now, in terms of access to opportunities to learn the local dominant language, that's where I think that we need training programs to be more cognizant of the needs of people with disabilities and to accommodate those needs within the classroom or the training setting. So, speaking from the perspective of the United States, refugees resettling here are all required to gain English as a second language training or ESL training. And what we have observed in our own research is that oftentimes the training locations are not accessible for people using wheelchairs. So that's one thing that needs to be addressed. The other thing is, some people with disabilities might not be able to leave their homes because of the severity of their impairment. So in such scenarios, home tutors can be made available. I have myself served as a home tutor for a woman who was not disabled but heavily pregnant and could not go physically to the ESL training center. So similar, opportunities should also exist for people with disabilities. For those who are blind or low vision, I think that ESL programs need to de-emphasize recognition of the English alphabet and instead focus more on conversational English integrated with training on using screen readers, because that's going to be functionally more relevant to those individuals. And then for people who are deaf or hard of hearing, I think that the emphasis should shift from English as second language training to ASL training or American Sign Language training, because again, that's going to be more functional and useful for those individuals.
Thank you so much, ma'am. So basically, the authorities should take charge of this issue, and they should bring forth many organizations or like features due to which this language barrier problem can be solved.
Mhm.
My next question to you is: children with psychological disabilities may often face discrimination in the host country. Sometimes they are even excluded from education. What steps can be taken in order to resolve this issue?
So I would say that, discrimination and limited access to educational opportunities affect children with both physical and psychological disabilities. And I think how to address that issue would really depend on the context. So if we are talking about, refugee children with disabilities living in the context of a refugee camp in a developing country in the global south, then, the infrastructure just might not be sufficient to accommodate the needs of children with disabilities within classroom settings. Just locally, not just for the refugee children, but even for local citizens with disabilities. And so, in such a scenario, honestly don't see a way around, addressing the issue without the involvement of the international community, so international NGOs and humanitarian aid organizations. And one step that they could take is possibly work in collaboration with local municipalities and local governments to establish disability inclusive educational programs, and then offer opportunities to local children to enroll in those programs, but also contingent on this understanding that a certain percentage of the spots available would be reserved for refugee children as well, based on the numbers and based on the need. So that is what I would, recommend in the scenario of the global south. But if we're talking about, an industrialized country in the global north, like the United States, the educational infrastructure is there for accommodating the needs of children with disabilities, refugee or not. However, here I think that there is more of a need to educate families on those possibilities and also local laws related to accessibility within the education system. So here we have a law called the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, and a lot of refugee families are not aware of it, or that their rights have, or their children have rights to accessible, equitable education under that law. So I think that we need that level of training. And then on the other hand, we also need teachers and special educators to be more aware of the situation that refugee children are coming from and be a little bit more trauma informed in their educational offerings to these children and families.
Thank you, ma'am. So now with this, we come to the end of today's session. Thank you so much for joining us. I would once again like to say that we are calling for submissions of stories, poems, and essays, and for project architecture and submission guidelines, please visit our website. I would like to extend a heartfelt thank you to Professor Ron McCallum, Professor Jill Rosenthal, Professor Pankaj Jyoti Gogoi, and Professor Mansha Mirza for a truly remarkable session. It was wonderful to have you. Thank you so much.
Thanks for having us.